Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking to you about my doctoral research project, which is about the labor market and work experiences of transgender people in the Greater Toronto and Greater Hamilton areas. And when I went into this project, the pandemic hadn't, or when I had been conceiving of this project, in Canada at least, the pandemic hadn't really hit. I expected a lot of things. I expected to find a lot of things. And then when you get in the field, of course, it's very different. And then when you get in the field during a pandemic, that's a whole other thing. And so I'm just going to be talking about a small aspect of my project here today. And that is about kind of remote work arrangements and people who were kind of pushed out of the workplace during the pandemic. So just a little bit about my project. I, to date, have done 24 semi-structured interviews with trans people, and my eligibility criteria is you identify as trans, 18 plus, either employed or unemployed, but looking for work, and living or working in the Greater Toronto and Greater Hamilton areas. And so because of the pandemic, the recruitment and the interviews really took place primarily online. I did a tiny bit of in-person or like Zoom meeting recruitment. But for the most part, I've used Reddit and the social media accounts of trans and LGBTQ2S plus organizations to, get information about my study out there. And so I've actually been in data collection for about a year, and this was not on purpose. I do think that this, was just a challenge kind of to do with already working with a hard to reach population during a pandemic, and then some very well-earned mistrust of researchers in the 2S LGBTQ community. And so I've done all of my interviews over Zoom or the phone, and they are about 45 minutes to an hour and a half. And in addition to the interviews, I'm also doing a survey and content analysis of GoFundMe campaigns. And these are GoFundMe campaigns that are searchable under the Supporting Canada's Transgender Community heading on GoFundMe. And so my search criteria is that they are Ontario-wide. They are set up either by or for trans people to cover emergency costs like housing or, repairs of an essential vehicle, transition-related costs. So either for, a gender-affirming surgery or for hormones. Or facial feminization surgery, or just to cover basic necessities, especially for people who are out of work. And so I have analyzed 44 GoFundMe campaigns that are cover kind of the whole range of Ontario that were set up between February 2020 and February 2022. And just gonna make sure I'm not missing anything here. Yeah, I think I'm good. As I said before, this is just a kind of one small facet of my project. And so today I'm going to be talking to you about kind of the effect of remote work arrangements on workers who were able to access remote work, so primarily white collar workers. And then workers who were either laid off or completely lost their job with no kind of hope of coming back to that workplace during the pandemic. And so I really expected there to be negative mental health, impacts and negative financial impacts. But I actually heard a lot of really interesting positive things about, this time of social isolation, this time of being away from social interaction, which can be really, really difficult to navigate for transgender people, especially depending on the degree to which you can pass. So this is a term that's often used to, refer to how smoothly or how well someone can navigate the social world and be interpreted as their gender versus, their gender that was assigned at birth. And so this has a lot to do with facial characteristics, mannerisms, the tone of your voice, and things like that. And so just in thinking, I might actually skip ahead just a little bit and go back to that slide. What I found in these conversations was that a lot of people were telling me about how social isolation and, not having to go into the workplace, not having to go and navigate the social world, led them to kind of have time to reflect, have time to undergo some self-discovery, think about, who they are. And so for some people, they realized that they were trans during the pandemic, and then other people who knew they were trans, but were maybe, out only socially to friends and family, or out only to like the HR person at their work, or had not started to undergo kind of physical changes that are associated with medical facets of transition, like surgeries and hormone replacement therapy. These people, took the time while they were kind of out of the public eye, out of the gaze of others, to undergo some changes, take steps to do things that would really affirm them, and that they could go through these changes behind the scenes, away from the prying eyes of their coworkers, or being on public transit and things like that. So this is something that the people I've spoke to have been like, oh, well, I see online like so many people. We went into the pandemic thinking that we were cisgendered, so your gender assigned at birth, and then going through the pandemic, being like, no, I'm a trans person. So I heard this over and over, and so these are just some kind of online news articles about this phenomenon, but it's something I've only seen a little bit in academic literature. And so in thinking about, this time away from the public eye, not going into the workplace, so kind of the theoretical tools that I am, relying on to help me kind of make sense of this and think about it, are particularly sociology of gender literature on doing gender from Weston Zimmerman, about, how gender is, particularly, the binary gender is produced and reproduced in the social sphere, in our social interactions, in relation, it's context specific, but in relation to our day-to-day interactions with others, and that we are held accountable by others, on how well or how either whether we subvert it, there's going to be either benefits or drawbacks based on your ability to do, or your refusal to do gender in accordance to the kind of set out and context specific social norms. And then also Connell 2010 tells us that the workplace is a key site for the reproduction of gender inequality. And so also thinking about being trans in the workplace, and what does that mean in terms of inequality, and what does the reprieve from that that key site for this particular social interaction, what does that reprieve kind of do for people in terms of the ways that they can feel comfortable, can reaffirm themselves, and also can rethink kind of their whole life course. And then also gender as labor encompasses both the effective labor that's involved in the doing of gender, but also the effective labor of those who affirm or give gender to trans and gender diverse people. So instead of holding to account, you can be compassionate, generous, and give or affirm gender to others who may not either meet the norms or refuse to adhere to the social norms of the gender binary. And then also queer time is used to describe the ways in which heteronormative milestones in the life stage are often, vastly different for LGBTQ2S+ people, whether we're thinking about, thinking about, the general life stage, like college, marriage, children, retirement. These life stages are different when, so much of your own, who you are, you have to kind of navigate in very different ways. There's many more hurdles, and this is very much about like the private sphere and the reproductive realm, and so that's vastly different as well. And then also in terms of thinking about the temporality of the pandemic, and the shift in how we kind of navigate with the space around us, what spaces we are going into. Just the decrease in social activity, the closing down of so many sectors. Obviously, there are really devastating consequences to this, but it has also provided space for personal reflection, self-exploration, and personal growth. Yeah, and here. So in terms of pandemic measures, so kind of the two categories that I'm talking about here are people who were able to do remote work, or people who got laid off and had some sense of security that they were going back to work, or were laid off and didn't know when they would be finding work again. And so Botham and Joy, 2021, discuss the role of what has been termed queerantining or queerantined. So this period of social isolation, this reprieve from social interaction, as facilitating personal reflection, and as well as a greater understanding or a shift in the relationship to one's body. And then, so in terms of remote work, the people who I spoke with who were able to switch to remote, or who found work that was going to stay remote after the pandemic, a lot of these people took the opportunity to undergo hormone replacement therapy, kind of away from the eyes of their coworkers, and to kind of explore new ways of dressing. And then for trans women and trans feminine people in particular, remote work allowed for a relaxing of effective labor, especially in workspaces where there's kind of strict expectations around a professional femininity. So in thinking about makeup, the type of clothing that you need to wear, things like that, makeup and hair. And so people could, spend less time and have more time for leisure, more time for themselves, could have time for breakfast in the morning, because they did not have to, when you can have your Zoom camera off, they didn't have to put in as much of this effective labor to present themselves in a way that would be clearly understood as feminine. And then on the flip side of that, for people who were just coming to understand their gender identity during this period, remote work and working from home and having the Zoom camera off allowed some people to explore that effective labor that they would not be able to safely do in the workplace at that point. So it's interesting. It goes both ways depending on where you are kind of in your gender journey. And the degree to which those kinds of, makeup and hairstyling affirms or, is kind of neutral for your own understanding of your gender. And then those who had to conduct quite a bit of work over the phone, especially those who were trans women or trans feminine and had a lower voice, they reported a greater frequency of being misgendered. And so personally, I'm not an advocate of, kind of assuming someone's gender based on what they looked like, but these are very important cues, visual cues to be able to kind of decide, who do I think this person is? So without those visual cues, there was a higher instance of being misgendered over the telephone. And for those who were not able to switch to remote work, who largely worked in the service sector or the creative industries, a lot of my participants took on solo self-employment and kind of side work. Sometimes it was work that they already were doing kind of on the side throughout their career anyway, but this became kind of their main form of income. And so a lot of my participants also really benefited from CERB. And so obviously the CERB at $2,000 a month was a lot higher than most social, social security or government supports. And it was much more widely accessible, a lot easier there weren't as many hoops to jump through to get it. And so this made a huge difference, especially to low-income workers. And for many, even if they were only able to access CERB for a couple of months, they were able to save money from their CERB and kind of carry it forward to help them ride out the rest of the pandemic. And then the GoFundMe campaigns, they really highlight the financial strain that was placed on low-income workers in sectors deemed non-essential. So throughout these kind of 44 campaigns, there's a lot of, people write these appeals. So there's a lot of discussion about what someone is going through, why they need this money. And a lot of people reported having challenges finding work or losing work completely. And finally, I just have some quotes. I'm not going to read them, but they kind of highlight, I think, what's 3 kind of different typologies that come through in this work about how people have been impacted. And so I will leave it there. We can get into more details in the discussion. So thank you so much for your time.